related to each other in their adjacency and in their total interaction, and also even in this instance as simple, but which as Jema showed was not at all simple, as thinking about designing for encouraging use of bicycles in commuting to work. So these different levels, this notion of qualitatively different skills. Now I also thought, though Jema didn't bring this out, that the end of his talk made sense in some ways at the beginning of his talk. Because if you remember, at the beginning of his talk, he started with this slide of Eames' furniture. And he talked roughly, my notes were very scribbled, I may have got them down slightly inexactly, of a sort of modernity of discrete objects. He said, previously 20th century design had been, and he used terms like object-centered, static material, machine-made but hand-designed. You can see the emphasis. The emphasis is basically formal configuration around the object. And then he used a slide, and it's of a Detroit school here. And he used this to define 20th century designing in terms of messy, unbounded systems operating in dysfunctional settings, the collision of the artificial and the natural, local, global interactions, all of these kinds of things. We may say that in this particular instance, this shows another collision, another problem of contending with what we have made. This was, in fact, a Detroit public school. What happened in 2010 was that the school district abandoned one summer unilaterally 41 schools across Detroit and set up a series of new academy schools. There was a lot of financial corruption involved in this. It was federal funds. It was a local ongoing scandal, and they simply abandoned the school. In effect, Jema was using this as a sort of symbolic model, the contrast between almost modernity's notion of making the beautiful object that would kind of tidy the world. And now we're really kind of, how the hell do we deal with, in a sense, what we've made? So, in my view, contending with what. Translate this into my language, which is one of Jema's, and I'd say that it's now the difference between designing artificial things and designing as a capability, contending with the consequences and implications of the artificial systems we have created. So I think that's the shift there. So from designing artificial things, 20th century, to designing as a capability. That's why my notes on capability I gave you, which I'll talk about next week. And I don't think we're abandoning things, but we're definitely moving beyond the territory of the product and the object. And if you, I gave you the little Baudrillard article, where he actually talks about objects a lot, how objects are a creation of this particular period of capitalist industrialization, and I think we have to actually kind of literally begin to move beyond the object of the concept, maybe even by actually recovering thingness in certain ways. And it's this that we're really looking at now in these lectures, designing as a capability contending with the consequences and implications of the artificial systems we are created. Almost every talk now deals with them. Just to show you, though, that there is a kind of bleeding from history across modernity and post-modernity. Here's a perfect example of this bleeding. Here is actually, in retrospect, one of the most interesting things that Charles Eames designed. Was not particularly regarded in his design lexicon in the 20th century, people focused on his furniture, but he designed a plywood splint in World War II and made he set up a little workshop to make these molded plywood. And these were incredibly practical. There's one in use here. And the reason why they were previously using, for American soldiers, metal splints on broken legs, which were extraordinarily uncomfortable. And as men were carried off the battlefield, they almost caused as many injuries as they were supposed to have. So, Eames's creation of a very lightweight plywood splint, very easy to carry. You can see how the leg sort of fits into it here. That's a real development. I'd call that closer to 21st century design. So the question we need to ask now is really, need to ask kind of double question. What is the artificial, or what are artificial systems, and what do they tell us about the design? How can we sort of approach this? I want to start with the kind of paradox of the writings we gave you, and which that paradox is that in the earliest writings of technology, in the readings we gave you, Herbert Simon, he moves straight into talking about the design. The more recent readings, all from 1990s, 2000, 2010, all the technology readers don't mention design. Now why? What's the difference? What forces Simon to immediately align design and the artificial? If you read the preface, which I gave you deliberately, because it has a lot of little gems of intelligence in there, Simon says that he came to the whole process of the artificial systems when he began by studying administrative organizational behavior. That's where he started from. He finished up in economics, cognitive science, computing, artificial intelligence, started. And he says, he says words to this effect, that in studying these kind of organizations, he began to encounter artificiality, as he puts it, in its pure form. Meaning by this, he says something like non-natural systems molded by goals and purposes to the environments in which they live and operate. And he says further, as research took me into other areas, it became evident that the problem of artificiality is not peculiar to administration and organization. It infected, this is rather interesting term, a wider range of subjects, for instance, economics, all those parts of psychology concerned with rational behavior, thinking, problem solving, learning, and then, as I said, he went through into computing, artificial intelligence. As he went through and studied and worked in these areas, three things become apparent, or three things we can pull out of Simon. And these are the three things. The first one is that the major difference between natural and artificial systems is that while natural phenomena have an air of necessity about them, in their subservience to natural law, stress those three terms, artificial phenomena have an air of contingency in their malleability by the environment. And systems, given different circumstances, that might be quite other than they are. We almost would say systems that, given different circumstances, will be quite other. Notice, so that they're not law-determined, they're radically contingent, circumstantial, and notice that the environment stands in relation to artificiality as law does to science, a natural phenomenon. That's interesting. Relationship will come back to. The second characteristic is that they're one way or the other, they're goal-directed. They involve oughts, concerned not with how things are, but with how they might be. And Simon does immediately ensure, he said, they are concerned with design. He's emphatic about it. They can't not be concerned with the design. And he adds further this remarkable line, which you probably hope you've all read. The possibility of creating any science or sciences of the artificial is exactly as great as the possibility of creating any science of design. The two possibilities stand and fall together. So for Simon, once oughts enter into the system, and such systems are intrinsically involved in the design. You can't pull the two things apart. Thirdly, less important but still significant, and I'll show you why, is that there is an internal relationship between artificiality and complexity, internal in terms of our interest, our intellectual interest in that. And he said the topics of artificiality and complexity are inextricably intertwined. It sounds pretty straightforward until we realize, in fact, that it's possible to transpose Simon's definition of science. Simon, in that early preface, has a definition of science. He does it under that little diagram, the diagram of the triangle. The central task of natural science is to make the wonderful commonplace, to show that complexity correctly viewed is only a mask for simplicity. Turn that round. The central task of the sciences of the artificial, this is my twist of Simon, is to make the commonplace wonderful, to show that apparent simplicity correctly viewed is only a mask for complexity. You see what I'm trying to do here? The aurora borealis is truly rather wonderful, and beyond my understanding. To read up in Wikipedia last night, I proud of myself to find out how it worked. But what I need to insist on, in a way, is that one of our problems of thinking is exactly this. Because these things look dumb, we tend to think they're dumb. Let me reread you a quotation which I think I gave you very much at the start, but by Philip Rawson about ceramics. And just let this sink in, because it's a different kind of complexity. Pots fall into that category of primary discoveries involving the use of transformed elements in the world. Such discoveries and such use are both ingredients in a fundamental act of self-projection, which enables men to look at and manipulate things they've made. It may well be that the very notion of the thing as a unit which exists and is independent of other things is based in some way on that fundamental experience of transforming elemental material out of the unbroken tissue of outer and inner reality. What it creates is a self-contained usable object upon which a man projects his experience of himself, may show itself to him as a separate vehicle of individual being. To their makers and pots, to makers and users, pots have always been a kind of two-way revelation. First, of man to himself as a creative and independently working agent, and second, of the world to man as a medium, imbued with reality, which is able to transform. A pot thus contains both the reality of materials and processes and the inner realities of man's sense of identity in relationship to his own world of meaning. Ceramics may just be an important element in the world order created by a culture. In manipulated forms, a potter is manipulated and correlated complex meaning entities. Now, I read you that in order to try to get that sense of complexity within apparent simplicity, the complexity that we often deny. So we've got three prime conditions of the artificial. That's the systems are radically circumstantial or contextual, concerned not with how things are, but with how they might be, and concern complex systems that live in complex environments. And we could say that design enters, these are there we go, the three entities. Now we could say that design enters into each of these moments. Design is how systems are attuned to complex environments. It's how systems are organized to meet goals and ends. And it's how systems contend with changing circumstances. Let's look at that last one a bit. This lecture will interact with nature and evolution a bit. In natural systems, adjust to environmental change via evolution. You either succeed or you fail. This is one of the most famous examples that Darwin uses. It's pepper moths found in the north of England, and it was discovered as early as 1848 that some of the brighter moths in the Manchester area, Manchester, the heart of the Industrial Revolution, smoke and filth pouring out, trees, walls becoming blackened by smoke. Some of the smarter moths were turning themselves black. So against the soot surfaces, they would not see. And what scientists have actually recently discovered a minute genetic trigger which allows them to do that. And interestingly enough, since the 1960s and smoke abatement in the north of England, the black moths are beginning to die out again and the white moths are coming back because the black. It's rather beautiful. You either evolve, or like the poor dodo, that was a very slow, happy, fat little turkey-like bird on the island of Mauritius, who spent its life eating fruit which had fallen from trees, but was a flightless bird and was highly welcomed by Dutch sailors when they arrived. And they ate a lot. Presumably the dodo was not able to genetically develop a process, the decayed set of powerful wings that fly away. So, in a sense, we have to then think about design as, to some extent, the compensation for evolution. Because in artificial systems, we need something like evolution. We need, in fact, orchestration. There is not. Artificial systems do not possess, as it were, the genetic code which permits for transformation. So design is kind of like, in a way, but not quite like, we'll see, evolution. It's the mattering, or in part a matter, of attempting to artificially attune environments, artificially attune systems to the environments in which they exist. So we should say that design is a kind of speeded up attempt at making a fit between what we make and the world that things and systems operate in and in relationship to. Simon goes so far as to assert, in fact, that this, anthropologically speaking, is what human beings are. It's what we do as human beings. Most of the complexity of our behavior may be drawn from our interaction with environments, from our search for good designs. Simon's bold statement. And we can see that in some ways we can kind of understand that. Vernacular architecture is a way of doing that. A way of searching for good designs to keep a culture in being, to keep a way of life in being, to hold it there, to prevent it from disintegrating, which is the prime characteristic of traditional societies. We are in a different context, where we are actually kind of pathologically speeded up, overloaded with information, desperately trying to make sense from a world which is no longer constant at all. How do we kind of cope with this? Even this attempt to web train that for 2007. We can't actually keep hold. We have got systems in flux. Badly need something like, we have to start thinking about what could be the artificial equivalent of evolution, in fact. I will talk about that as we come through the lecture. But let's take further these three prime characteristics that we've identified about artificial systems and adapt them into three conditions that we can give and to look at these and use these to look at the design through. So I'll abstract the first three characteristics, qualities, into three conditions. Mediation, or interaction with environments. All artifice does this. Some form of mediation. There is the condition in artifice that things could be other. This is a prime condition. It can't be taken away from artifice. And the third condition is that we only ever see artifice through the concrete and the propositional. We only actually see it in actuality. And this is the condition of the configurational, which I'll deal with next week. I hope to deal with the first two now this week. Let's have a look at this question about the mediation. Let's begin here. At the beginning of chapter 5, Simon says this: the artificial world is centered on the interface between inner and outer environments. It's concerned with obtaining goals by adapting the former to the latter. Inner environment, for Simon here, means the inner environment of the thing itself that will work. The outer environment is nature, physical goals. He formulates it like this in more depth. We can view the matter quite symmetrically. An artifact can be thought of as a meeting point, an interface in today's terms, between an inner environment, the substance and organization of the artifact itself, and an outer environment, the surroundings in which it operates. If the inner environment is appropriate to the outer environment, and vice versa, the artifact will serve its intended purpose. Thus, if a clock is immune to buffeting, it will serve as a shaped chronometer. Now, this is fine as far as it goes, but it misses two crucial points. One, Simon's notion of meeting point makes the artifact sound a little bit passive, as if it's somehow just a passive recipient. But artifacts are not passive, they are active. This is supposed to be the world's biggest machine. It's called Trench 2. It was built by Krups in Germany for large-scale open cast mining, which is pretty big. It's not passive. Is what we call in England a bloody great show. Second is the notion of outer environment and inner environment that Simon's using. Works for technological artifacts, but only for technology. When he says a theory of the airplane draws on natural science for an explanation of its inner environment, the power plant, for its outer environment, the character of the atmosphere at different altitudes, and the relationship between both in the movement of the airfoil, that Simon's model sounds good like that. But Simon's model leaves out the most crucial environment in practice, which is the subject, the human being for whom artifacts are made. We might argue that only if the artifact or system can address the world of the user by body, mind, or sentience, as well as the social worlds that the subject is imbricated in, can the artifact or the system work for and on behalf of the user. Here we must remember we don't make things just for. We make them for reciprocal consequences. Coat to keep us warm, iPhone to allow us to communicate, map to help us navigate, a poem to allow us to reflect upon experience. Everything we do is for this reciprocal consequence. Now one could reread Simon's sentence so that the inner world is the world of the subject. So if we could read it like the inner world is centered on the interface between inner and outer environments. It's concerned with attaining goals by adapting the former to the latter. You can just about twist it. But even this formula is not quite right, because the outer environments are not merely physical. For us, they're really social, cultural, ecological, political, economic. They're actually multiple dimensions. And we need to preserve the element of the inner environment of the thing, which we might better call, to save confusion, configuration. So we need a more complex model of mediation, where we understand the artifact